Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is the final part 15 of my Knights of the Frozen Throne card review. This time around I have all the remaining cards, which I think is 20 cards for this particular review. So I'm going to be going through these really quickly, because there's so many cards, and because the expansion's almost here, and I have other videos to make. So these won't be nearly as detailed as normal. Not to mention, a lot of these cards are sort of the filler cards of the expansion. Although I have to say, Blizzard certainly did a better job with the filler cards this time around, giving them all unique designs and unique effects. Often still not that great, or a little bit simple, but not just vanilla statted minions with, random costs like we've seen in so many previous expansions. So of course, detailed reviews up front, but even the detailed reviews will probably be like 30 seconds instead of a few minutes per card. But then I'll follow it up with quick reviews. That'll just be my 1 to 5 star ratings of the cards. You can see a link in the description below that'll take you to that point if you're really short on time, but still going to do some light discussion for each of these cards. So let's go ahead and jump into the barely detailed reviews portion of this video. Up first is the Deadscale Knight, a new neutral Murloc minion. Very simple 1-mana 1/1 with lifesteal. I think the challenge for this card is essentially that lifesteal is probably more of a defensive mechanic, and Murlocs and Murloc synergies in general are more offensive in nature. They're trying to be aggressive. So I don't think lifesteal necessarily contributes to that plan. Maybe in a Murloc Paladin deck that's got a ton of mid-range tools and some defensive capabilities, this could work. But I think this is one of those things that just exists to exist, and that's okay. It's not going to be run in constructed lists, but it might come off other cards, might be summoned, and it's an important, interesting little 1-mana minion, although not probably playable in constructed, still an interesting and cool card. After that is the Acharis Better, another 1-mana minion. A 2/1, this time with a Battlecry, give a friendly minion +1 attack. So a really cool aggressive tool here. Again, I'm not sure this card's strong enough necessarily to be played in constructed. Will be an interesting arena choice. In a hyper-aggressive deck that's all about face damage, this card does make a little bit of sense. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I think it's a strong card with good stats for its cost. It reminds you a lot of Abusive Sergeant pre-nerf. Not as strong as Abusive Sergeant in general, I don't think, but a similar kind of card. So has some potential to be decent and might even see some constructed play from time to time. Up next is the Wretched Tiller, a 1-mana 1/1. And I cannot tell what's going on in this artwork. I guess it's a dude with massive shoulders on a tiny horse, or there's some weird perspective going on. I'm not really sure, but the effect here is that whenever this minion attacks, deal 2 damage to the enemy hero. So basically, it's a 3-attack minion for heroes, but only a 1-attack minion for the board, which is a cool design because it basically encourages a really aggressive face kind of deck without giving the minion too much trading value or too much board value. Unlike a card which we saw in the past, like Small Time Buccaneer, for instance, which would go up to 3 attack but still be really influential on the board, which had to get nerfed. This feels like a much better design. Not strong enough to be played for that reason. It's not going to contest the board at all. It's just pure face play, so I don't think it's good enough in that regard. But an important distinction and an important design from Blizzard, just on what will ultimately be a pretty average, or in fact even below average card. After that is the Tainted Zealot, a new 2-mana 1/1 with Divine Shield and spell damage +1. So this is sort of in the mold of the Blood Mage Thanos, Kobold Geomancer 2-mana spell damage minions. I still don't think this is nearly as good as the Thanos, but it's maybe a budget Thanos for some people who don't really feel like Kobold Geomancer does much. I think this is probably better than that in a lot of ways, because spell damage minions are typically the kinds of things you'd want to keep around on the board for multiple turns. I think Divine Shield helps to do that more successfully than just the extra health on Kobold Geomancer. So if you're looking for a replacement Thanos, this might be the option for you. Might work in a Divine Shield deck. It's not a terrible card by any means. It's probably not going to be played a ton, but I think it has some viability in constructed. And then after that, we have another spell damage minion here. This is the Tuskar Fisherman, a 2-mana 2/3. I don't know why a Tuskar Fisherman has anything to do with spell damage. That seems a little weird thematically from a fantasy or lore standpoint, as far as I can tell. But regardless, this is just another way to get spell damage on a 2-mana minion. But this one is much more situational because you do have to have a minion on board. So although you get some nice stats here for a 2-mana card, This is the kind of thing that'll be just fine in Arena because it's a solid 2-drop, but I don't expect this to ever really see any kind of play in Constructed, because if you need spell damage, you probably need it in a variety of board states at a lot of different points in the game, much more consistently than the Tuskar Fisherman could provide. Up next is the Vrygoul, a new 3-mana 3/1 with a Death Rattle. If it's your opponent's turn, summon a 2/2 Ghoul, so another one of these cards where you summon something if it dies on your opponent's turn. Similar stats here to many of those cards, with much lower health than attack, to sort of incentivize your opponent to kill it, which also gives you a benefit. And they don't kill it, it allows you to trade up. Unfortunately, I really don't think this card is even nearly as good as Egg Napper, a card which is already very similar to these stats. And the 2/1/1s are arguably even better than the 2/2 you might get, but it's not conditional. It works every time. It's much more predictable. So Rygel just looks like a considerably worse version of a card that we already have to me that's only as successful a part of the time. So I don't really like what Vrygoul has to offer. Up next is the Hyldnir Frostrider, a 3-mana 4/4 with a battlecry, freeze your other minions. So the idea here is that battlecry is theoretically a downside, where you punish yourself in order to get some extra stats on the board, basically one extra attack over what you'd expect from a vanilla 3-drop minion. So if you play it on an empty board, it's just all upside, which is cool. That's nice. That'll be really strong in Arena. If you play it with some sort of frost synergies, like an Amurabi Freeze Shaman deck, that would be some cool synergies too. So I can see a couple places where this card has some theoretical applications. I do think, though, that the downsides here are probably bigger than the upsides, because, for instance, you'd want a minion like this in a more aggressive deck, which would typically tend to have more minions on the board early, and this could punish those kinds of plays. So I think this one, although it has that utility and potential, is probably going to be hard to use and be an unsuccessful card in Constructed format in general. So I don't really like the Hyldnir Frostrider all that much. So the next card on the list is the Grave Shambler, a 4-mana 4/4. An elemental, believe it or not, and whenever your weapon is destroyed, this minion gains +1/+1. So an understated 4-drop at its core. If you do destroy a weapon with it on board, it actually turns into a 5/5, which is slightly above stat 4-drop. But still, just a 5/5 for 4 these days is not enough to make a big impact. I think it's very unlikely this minion ever gets multiple buffs, or if it does, something else is going wrong because you're destroying minions, or you're destroying weapons far too often, or you're already winning the game super hard anyway because your opponent simply can't remove a 5/5 or a 4/4 minion, in which instance this feels like a win more card in some ways, or just a card that doesn't contribute at all given whichever scenario you're in. So feels like a fairly weak card to me. Often a Chillwind Yeti looks like it might be better for a majority of classes. And really, elementals and weapon classes beyond exactly Shaman haven't gone together very much so far. So maybe a weird synergy there. Cool idea. Interesting elemental tag. Some potential synergies could exist, but most likely I think this card will just be a failure. So up next is the Knight Howler, a new 4-mana 3/4. This is an Enrage synergy minion. Essentially, whenever this minion takes damage, you gain +2 attack, so sort of a mini Gurubashi Berserker. But it's not really that mini, right? Because even the Gurubashi Berserker comes in at 5 mana, and I think it has much more favorable stats and a better effect because it gains 3 attack per damage taken compared to the Knight Howler. So I don't think the Knight Howler makes any sense at all. Very weak, too susceptible to dying, not enough upside. Just a far worse version of a basic card like the Gurubashi Berserker. So I'm all in on Gurubashi Berserker over Knight Howler in a deck that needs it. And frankly, not even that many decks need it. So this looks like a bad card. After that is the Grim Necromancer, a new 4-mana neutral minion. It's a 2/4 with the battlecry summon 2/1/1 skeletons. So similar to like Dragonling mechanic, if you want to compare it to a classic card. But you get 1/1s instead of a single 2/1s. I think that's considerably better. I'd rather have multiple 1/1s, multiple bodies on the board. So this maybe has some applications in like a flood deck where you're trying to get tons of stuff out on the board, like we've seen with Token Shaman. That said, I don't think it's better than some of the tools and cards available at that mana cost already for Shaman, so I don't think that exact list makes sense for this. And I'm sure most decks will be able to find a 4-drop that suits a similar need, but does so in a much stronger or higher synergy way. So although the Grim Necromancer looks like a fine card at its core, I suspect it will not see any play in Constructed. After that is the Wicked Skeleton, another 4-drop here. This one starts as a 1/1 with a Battlecry gain +1/+1 for each minion that died this turn. So, you know, there are instances where 3-4 minions can die in a single turn, certainly. And this can become a 5/5, which is an above statted 4-drop. There are going to be way more instances where only 1 or 2 things have died in a given turn. And this is like a 2/2 or a 3/3 that you simply can't afford to play because you're spending too much mana on a card that's not very good. And then there's potential upsides for this card where you've killed, like, you know, 10 things on board. And suddenly it's an 11/11. But I think those instances are going to be incredibly rare. And they're not going to be worth the instances where this just sits in your hand unplayable. Even in a deck, you know, with like Maelstrom Portals and tons of AoE removal like that and finishing off, you know, token minions with AoE, I still don't think this thing at its cost is going to have enough upside to make it work. So, it seems like Wicked Skeleton, cool idea, really, really interesting mechanic. I like the design, and the artwork is awesome looking. It's really, really crazy cool. But probably just not a card that's worth the risk for the reward. So I don't see this finding a home in Constructed. So up next is the Bloodworm, a new 5-mana 4/4 beast with Lifesteal. Clearly these stats are a bit undervalued for a 5-drop in general, so the Lifesteal has to make up for that fact. I'm a little curious who wants to use this card. Maybe a Control Hunter could find some use for Bloodworm where it's just a heal stabilization because Hunter is low on heal. But I'm just so worried that at 4 health it dies far too easily to far too many things and will never really get to attack to actually use that Lifesteal and gain any heals. I'm sure there are just better defensive tools or removal tools available to Hunter than what Bloodworm can offer. But I do think it's important for this card to exist because of things like Deathstalker Rexar's hero power or just all the random beast summoning effects. Like, this is a really good card to have in the pool of beasts available because it's gonna show up all the time in Constructed just off random effects. It also gets added into, for instance, the Firelands portal pool of cards and Evolve and all of those things. So although this is not good enough to make many deck lists, in my opinion, I really, really like that this card is around, and I'm glad Blizzard printed it because it's going to make a significant impact on Hearthstone in a way that we're not expecting or thinking about immediately. So Bloodworm is an intriguing little card. After that, we have the Venomancer, a new 5-mana 2/5 poisonous minion. I really just don't like high-cost poisonous things. I don't think it's worth it. Typically, you probably want your poisonous on smaller things that can trade up and be frustrating for your opponent to deal with. In cards like this, they don't really feel bad necessarily using a fireball on it, so it doesn't feel like you got a ton of value out of it necessarily. There are better targets and better minions you could run with higher upside and more potential and more raw value than a card like Venomancer at similar cost to eat those fireballs out there, right? So, you know, we've seen Myexna, for instance, before. It looks fairly similar here to the Venomancer in mana cost and stat allocation, and that was certainly never a successful card, and I expect a similar fate for the Venomancer. But if mancing Venom is not your thing, you can mance Skellies, apparently, because this is the Skelemancer. This is another 5-mana Mancer minion. This time it's a 2/2 with a Death Rattle. If it's your opponent's turn, summon an 8/8 skeleton. So once again, one of these minions that really disincentivizes your opponent from killing it. The problem with this one in normal play is that there's really no reason they have to kill a 2/2, right? They're just happy to leave a 5-mana 2/2 on the board and never kill it and just let you do it. So although it does provide some immunity perhaps to things like AoE effects, I think in general there's not going to be a lot of board states where this ends up being a favorable play for its cost. I like the design on this one more than many of those other opponent's turn style cards because it does make Flame Strikes a risk and Blizzards and all that stuff. Your opponent's like, man, I can't really Flame Strike with that on board. It also is a counter to things like Doomsayer. If they play Doomsayer, you can drop your Skelemancer and suddenly they summon you an 8/8 when their Doomsayer goes off, and they feel really, really bad about that. So I do think this card has some interesting applications. It's just going to require really specific metas or really specific top-tier prominent decks that it's countering in order for that to work. So it might actually work. If, you know, if Control Mage, for instance, were to stay a mainstay in the meta, Skelemancer could be a cool Death Rattle synergy card to run in a Death Rattle deck that counters that sort of thing. So I have a small glimmer of hope for Skelemancer. In general, at a glance, it looks bad, but there could be some interesting interactions that make it a successful card. So up next is the Spellweaver, a 6-mana 4/4 with spell damage +2. We've seen some +2 spell damage cards successful in the past with Evolved Kobold. I think the challenge for Spellweaver is that it costs so much mana, and it doesn't have enough health to stick around on the board, that it's going to be difficult to combo Spellweaver with spells to actually benefit from the spell damage in a single turn. So, you only have 4 mana left. Sure, you can do a single Fireball or Consecration or whatever, and that's fine, but most decks that want to run a card like this are looking for some sort of really specific spell damage utilization, like we saw with Freeze Mage in the past. So I think this leaves less flexibility and less room open for those decks to really use the mana in a powerful way using that spell damage. And otherwise, if you just get one spell off and your opponent's able to really successfully kill it, it's not really worth it for a 6-drop, right? You could have ran better minions that do more things actively themselves for 6 mana. So Spellweaver just looks too awkward as far as cost and effect and actual use in a game are concerned. So up next is the Keening Banshee, a new 4-mana 5/5 that's a bit like a light Fellreaver here. Whenever you play a card, you remove the top 3 cards of your deck. And if you're in an aggressive meta, for the record, that's not necessarily a bad downside. Or excuse me, if you're in an aggressive deck, that's not necessarily a bad downside. Because if you're not planning to go to fatigue anyway, you can burn 9-10 cards. As long as you kill your opponent first, doesn't matter that you burned those 9 or 10 cards. It means nothing. There's always a random card to draw at some point, as long as you don't run out of cards. The problem with something like Keening Banshee is you're not really getting anything extra for that risk. It's just a 5/5. If it was like a 4-mana 7/7 or a 4-mana 8/8, it'd be worth the risk, like Fellreaver was, where you can play it out and you know that you're getting so much extra value for that risk that the minimal risk it exposes you to was worth the trade. Keening Banshee's barely better than a Chillwind Yeti. So, even if you do burn 15 cards and you run out, you got 1 extra attack for that, which sucks. So this card just looks miserable to me. I see no advantage in it at all. Or I guess I see a 1 attack advantage in only very specific kinds of decks. And even then, there's still a little bit of risk at the end of the day. So absolutely not worth it. This is just a terrible card. I like that Blizzard's doing interesting things with it, but just an awful, awful card. So up next is the Furnacefire Colossus, a new 6-mana 6/6. With a battle cry, discard all weapons from your hand and gain their stats. And that's a super cool effect, right? So you discard an Arcanite Reaper, and suddenly this thing is an 11/8, because it gains 2 durability or health and 5 attack. And that's an 11/8 for 6 mana is kind of absurd. It's kind of ridiculous, right? So that's neat. It reminds me a lot of a card like Draconid Crusher in a deck like the old Dragon Warrior, where it could be a big 6 mana mid-range finisher style card where you're like, okay, I'm just literally going to put all my cards on the table because I'm throwing away half of them and put all my investments in a single big thing and hope it's enough to win me the game. And if you have a couple weapons in hand, like that might be worth the sacrifice just because you get such a big minion. If you're playing against like Druid, for instance, they don't have any hard removal, you know it's going to stick and you know it's going to win you the game. Beyond those very specific instances, I think it's going to be just too big of a payoff here because weapons are good cards. You don't want to lose weapons, right? They have a lot of utility because they essentially have charge. You can use your health as a resource with weapons for removal. That way minions are more likely to live. So I think this card has a lot of built-in risk, and the trade-off is very, very punishing. But if you build your deck correctly and you're on the exact right turn, it could work. Every other time, it's a bad Boulder Fist Ogre, basically, if you don't have weapons in hand. 6 mana, 6/6, it's okay, it's fine. Not a card anybody would want to run on its own. So, interesting, really, really intriguing design that I haven't given up hope for. I think there could be a home that makes this work, but in general, probably not the strongest card. So up next is the Deathaxe Punisher, a 4-mana 3/3. With a battle cry, give a random lifesteal minion in your hand +2/+2. So this is essentially a hand buff style card, but specifically for lifesteal minions, which I think is kind of cool. If you had something like a Wicker Flame Burn Bristle, for instance, you could be sure that you build yourself a really big Wicker Flame Burn Bristle, and your opponent is actually forced to interact through that Wicker Flame Burn Bristle because it has taunt. So I like that idea of the Deathaxe Punisher here, But of course, if you only have one card in your deck you're trying to hit successfully, that means you have to have both the cards in hand simultaneously, which never works out. If it doesn't work out, you're only getting a 3/3 for 4, which is really, really bad. So if you do build a more widespread lifesteal deck, I'm not sure that hand buffs in general are good necessarily, because you're sacrificing so many instant stats and instant value on the Deathaxe Punisher for a reward you get down the road with the lifesteal, and that can sacrifice a lot of tempo and board. So it feels like this one's going to be hard to fit and hard to work into a deck that makes a lot of sense. So even though he's holding an awesome Arcanite Reaper there in the artwork, I don't really think the Deathaxe Punisher is going to be a played card. So up next is the Drukre Enchanter, a new 3-mana 1/5 minion with your end of turn effects trigger twice as its own effect. So things like Ysera and Arthas, suddenly you can get multiple card creations out of cards like that. Things like Ragnaros hits for 8 damage twice. Baron Geddon ticks for 2 AoE damage twice. All sort of interactions here. There's a lot of end of turn effect kinds of cards that Drukre Enchanter can actually activate. I think the bigger challenge with Drukre Enchanter is getting both of those things out simultaneously. A lot of the cards I mentioned, for instance, cost more than 7 mana, which means you could not do them in a single turn for a guaranteed double proc. Even if you could, I worry that that's far too slow of a play, just because you're running Drukre Enchanter in your deck. You've been holding her in your hand for the entire game and not playing a card, which reduces your flexibility on any given turn up to that point. She has no utility outside of end of turn effects because she's just a 1/5. So she doesn't trade into anything. So I don't think this is a card that's going to very easily fit into a deck list without causing a lot of consistency issues in your draw and in your curve. And I don't really think the upside of hitting those end of turn effects twice is worth the downside of actually having to play this card. So I love her design. I think it's really, really intriguing, really fun, but not going to be a card that's played. And then finally I have one last card. I somehow missed the Exploding Bloatbat in the previous review where I looked at class cards, so I wanted to jump back and make sure I caught the Exploding Bloatbat here. This is a hunter card, a 4-mana minion. It's a 2/1 beast with the Death Rattle, deal 2 damage to all enemy minions. So it's sort of like an exploding sheep, but one that doesn't hurt your own side of the board. But it costs 4 mana and it only has 1 health. And you might say, well, 1 health's an upside if you're trying to kill it, right? You're trying to do damage to the enemy's stuff. And sure, that makes a little bit of sense. I like that logic. But this kind of card and Explosive Sheep in the past were kinds of cards that you probably play when you're really far behind on the board. Or at least you want to play when you're really, really far behind on the board and your opponent has a ton of stuff. Otherwise, it's a really expensive 2/1 minion. So the downside of the Explosive Sheep, for instance, that it hit your own stuff usually wasn't all that relevant because you don't have that much stuff on the board because you're behind. So that's fine, right? You're happy that it only cost you 2 mana because that's so much more flexible. And of course, as Mage with Explosive Sheep, you had a way to activate it yourself. Hunter, not necessarily going to have an easy way to activate the Exploding Bloatbat, particularly not efficiently so. So it's the kind of thing you play for 4 mana, it sits there because your opponent is not going to kill it for you if it's going to blow up their board. They're just going to keep going face. And then you probably get to trade it in and get some value out of it the following turn. And hopefully that stabilizes your board. But instances where 2 damage is enough don't always seem that likely because 3 health is a pretty magic number these days. So yeah, it kills totems and fireflies. But there's a lot of 3 health things out there too. So I feel like Exploding Bloatbat's going to have a challenge lining up the numbers nicely. I think it's really slow when you do it because you just sits there for a turn. The mana cost is really high. I don't think the Death Rattle synergies necessarily add in all that much value either. So this, although has a strong effect, feels like one of those cards that's really challenging to use and really awkward. And I don't think necessarily, even in a control hunter list, this is the sort of card you'd want to run. You might just be better off with an Explosive Trap and some sort of Explosive Trap or Secret Synergy, for instance. So Exploding Bloatbat, final card, unfortunately, of my entire Knights of the Frozen Throne review, just doesn't look that good to me. So there you go, guys. That wraps it up for my detailed portion of this review. Like I said, not all that detailed. And unfortunately, a lot of these cards are the filler cards, so not that many strong cards here. Some cool designs, just not too good in my opinion. So what I'd like to do now is go ahead and jump into the quick reviews and rate each of these cards from 1 to 5 stars, starting now. I think Deadscale Knight is a 2-star card. I think Acharis Better is a 2-star card. I think the Wretched Tiller is a 1-star card. I think Tainted Zealot is a 2-star card. I think Tuskar Fisherman is a 2-star card. I think Vrygoul is a 1-star card. I think Hyldnir Frostrider is a 2-star card. I think the Grave Shambler is a 1-star card. I think Night Howler is a 1-star card. I think Grim Necromancer is a 2-star card. I think Wicked Skeleton is a 1-star card. I think Bloodworm is a 3-star card. I think Venomancer is a 2-star card. I think Skelemancer is a 2-star card. I think Spellweaver is a 2-star card. I think Keening Banshee is a 1-star card. I think Furnacefire Colossus is a 2-star card. I think Deathaxe Punisher is a 1-star card. I think Drukre Enchanter is a 2-star card. And I think Exploding Bloatbat is a 1-star card. So don't let those ratings get you down, guys. Like I said, it's the filler cards. It's the card dump at the end of the expansion. Not all of these cards are supposed to be amazing all the time. 2 stars, for me, means it can possibly be played, which for a majority of cards in an expansion is a compliment. You know, there's only typically 20 or 30 cards that really see a ton of play in any given expansion. I think Unguro biased us a little bit because there were a lot of great cards in Unguro. So I'm not saying the expansion's going to suck. I'm saying these cards probably aren't going to be the strongest in the set for many obvious reasons. They're just neutral, generic minions. So all of that said, guys, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions on this review, of course, I love hearing your take in the comments below. Tell me what I'm wrong. Tell me what I got right. I want to hear all of it. But until then, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, game on.